Welcome to everyone who's joined. I see that the virtual room has begun to fill up. So today's panel is 2 years of diplomacy with the Taliban. It's hosted by the Quincy Institute, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Middle East program here. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, it's a think tank that bases its approach to U.S. foreign policy on a theory of restraint. In other words, we would like a less militarized foreign policy and one that is more focused on diplomacy and other forms of leverage. And we really have an esteemed panel today. We're joined by, and excuse me, their bios are so impressive, I have to read them off. We're joined by Trip Copeland, who worked as an intelligence analyst for the Department of Defense for over a decade and later served in the State Department for over 4 years. While at the State Department, he served for 3 years as a foreign affairs officer for the Office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation in Doha, where he engaged in face-to-face meetings with the Taliban. And then following the U.S. withdrawal, he served as a foreign affairs officer at the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs at the Office of Afghanistan Affairs. We're also joined by John Schroden, who is the director of the Center for Naval Analyses, Countering Threats and Challenges program, and you may remember him from past panels we've had on Afghanistan. And he deployed or traveled 13 times to Afghanistan during the U.S. war there, twice in support of the commander of ISAF and once in support of the Commander Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan. He also served as a strategic advisor to U.S. Central Command. And last but not least, we are joined by Shkula Zadran, and she's a graduate student of global affairs at NYU, but she also served as the Afghan youth representative to the United Nations in 2020 and has 5 years of experience working with NGOs focusing on Afghan IDPs, immigrants, women, and children. She left Afghanistan in August 2021 during the withdrawal of U.S. troops there. So today's panel is really going to be one that focuses on what's happened over the last 2 years and the path forward. I think there's been many panels looking back at what led to the collapse of the Afghan government and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. And we'll touch on that a little bit, but that's not going to be the main focus. Excuse me one moment. There seems to be a technical problem with one of our panelists. If our tech people could message Shkula, she's having trouble hearing us. I'm sorry for those listening, but if our tech people could take care of that, that would be great. So while Shkula is trying to figure out her audio, why don't we start with you, John. It's 2 years since U.S. troops left Afghanistan, and a lot has changed. Obviously, I don't think any of us fully envisioned that the Taliban would be completely in control of the country today and would have retained power. Given that difficult circumstance, what, in your view, are the main priorities of the United States government in Afghanistan today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thanks again for having me back, Adam. It's great to be joining you and Trip and Shkula as well. I think the U.S. has two main priorities in Afghanistan today. The first being counterterrorism, which is an enduring U.S. national interest in Afghanistan. Obviously, with the presence of the Islamic State, Khorasan province, ISKP, as well as remnants of Al-Qaeda as sort of international terrorist groups. And then you have a whole plethora of regional terrorist groups that are of interest to the United States as well. So that sort of threat of terrorism is one major interest that the U.S. has. The other is you could, I think, lump together a handful of other interests under the broader rubric of stability, right? U.S. is interested in the stability of Afghanistan, the stability of the South Asian region. And under that rubric, right, the U.S. points to things like pushing the Taliban to try and develop an inclusive government, something that would, minorities would see themselves in and be invested in, pushing for human rights and especially the rights of women and girls to go to school, to be able to work, et cetera. There are a bunch of other things that I think fall under this rubric of stability, but that inclusive government and women's rights, human rights are sort of the two pillars of that. So those two things I think are the U.S. Enduring interests in Afghanistan, which you still see the likes of Tom West and Rina Amiri working diligently to try and pursue day in and day out these days.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is in the ranking of these priorities, where do these all rank? I guess that would be my first question. And my second question would be, we always hear about women's rights, and I think what's needed on that front is obvious, but this point about an inclusive government, what does that really mean? The last government wasn't inclusive in a sense. That's why there was an insurgency. I think the Taliban have this image in their head that we're going to have token inclusivity. As long as we have one Hazara Taliban member and maybe a couple Tajik Taliban members, that's okay. That's inclusivity. What does inclusivity mean for the United States? And then where does it fall within these priorities? We have CT, we have inclusivity, we have women's rights. I think we all know that the US doesn't approach those things on an equal, basis, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have not seen anyone in the U.S. government assign a priority ranking to those things. The sense I get is that at any given time, depending on what the developments are that are ongoing in Afghanistan, one or the other of those may come to the fore as the immediate priority, if you will. But I'm not aware of any deliberate, ranking of those in priority order on the part of the U.S. government. Nor do I look at the activities. It's not like Tom West is somehow senior to Rina Amiri or vice versa, where they are both special representatives in terms of their portfolios on Afghanistan. And one, focuses on security and engagement and financial aspects, and the other focuses specifically on women's rights. And they work together, towards those priorities. So I don't know that there is an explicit ranking that one could point to. I think they ebb and flow in terms of the level of effort and importance the U.S. places on them. In terms of inclusivity, it has to be more than tokenism. You're right. The Taliban did try early on to, have a single Tajik or a single Hazaran in their government. I don't know if they thought that would actually fly, but they tried it. And of course, the international community was, resolutely unimpressed with that effort. And the Taliban quickly abandoned even any pretenses of having token minorities in their government. So I think from the U.S. perspective, they haven't set quotas. It's not like the U.S. has said there's X percent of, Tajiks in the country, and therefore you need to have X percent of your government be represented by Tajiks. So there is some amount of wiggle room in terms of what that would actually look like in practice. But I think it's fair to say that more than none is a baseline definition the U.S. would have of inclusivity, with an upper bound of something approaching the relative distribution of population percentages. Most likely, the U.S. would be satisfied with something in the middle. Anything beyond tokenism, I think the U.S. would probably say, okay, that's looking acceptable at a minimum.
Yeah, and that's the answer I've heard from U.S. officials and also from Pakistani officials. Pakistani officials I've talked to will also say including in the military, will also say they want inclusivity in Afghanistan because they see it as the only way to have long-term stability. For them, it means ethnic representation. Sometimes when I talk to U.S. officials, although I haven't heard this from the special representatives themselves, I hear them say that inclusivity has to mean more than just ethnic representation. It has to mean real participation by different groups. Nevertheless, the common thread is that unless the Taliban form an inclusive political order, there's bound to be instability and their rule is going to be challenged. Do you agree with that, Trip?
I think in the longer term, that's probably right. However, in the shorter term, I think the Taliban, that's sort of the means of control to stay in control of Afghanistan politically and militarily. I'll go back to this definition of political inclusivity. I think it's problematic that it's not sort of more well-defined in terms of what the international community is looking for. I sort of agree with all the points that Jonathan and you mentioned about Taliban wariness tokenism and trying to just sort of place ethnic minorities in their government. I think we should, this along with all the other U.S. priorities are really long-term challenges. So while I agree that those are the goals and sort of the interests and the objectives of the United States right now, to achieve those goals, we might focus on other areas of mutual interest that are sort of less priority to us to get us to a place where we can have like a more constructive conversation with the Taliban on these main priorities. I think we can have a conversation about what that approach and what that strategy looks like a little bit later in this conversation. But going back to inclusivity, I do agree it needs to be more than representation. I don't know exactly what that looks like in the Afghan context, but I think it'd be better if we could push the Taliban, again, very difficult to do, and it would take some time, to codify somehow real political agency and voice of regular Afghans in the decision-making process, right? Whether that looks like sort of a national consultative shura, sort of ad hoc regional consultative shuras. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think that codification of real representation and voice and political agency has a much greater chance of facilitating a more stable Afghanistan in the future.
Thanks for that answer. We dove into the weeds a little bit, but I actually wanted to ask Shkula the first question, but we had some tech issues. That's just part of the virtual panels, but I think the virtual panels also allow us to all be together even when we're not in the same location. And I can look at the attendees list. We have people from all over the world. So, you have to take the good with the bad. So Shkula, we're talking about things from a policy perspective. For the, three of us who are on this panel, this is something that we think about from a policy angle or maybe a national interest angle or maybe a professional perspective, but it hasn't affected our lives the way it has yours. So I think I just want to anchor this conversation from the beginning, which I wanted to do in the opening, with acknowledging that we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of the Taliban takeover. It's a month that's hard for most Afghans. And I just wanted to ask you, what does this month mean for you as a young Afghan who participated to some degree in the past government?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me, Adam. As time passed, my understanding of events has deepened, and my emotions associated with those events became complex. And but one thing never changed. August is always a reminder of the Republic's collapse. Not only the Republic's collapse, but the collapse of the entire generation and their aspirations and dreams. August and the following years stands as a historical lesson and a compelling case study for scholars and academics that the end of an active battle or war doesn't necessarily mean the establishment of long-lasting and positive and meaningful peace. Additionally, this month and events related to this month, they just shows that they're just an indication of a failed state building mission in Afghanistan that can be again a lesson learned for the world in terms of that pouring money, unlimited money and unlimited money in a country and bringing experts from abroad isn't enough to build responsive institutions and states. And finally, one thing that I actually like, it's for me, it's a very personal lesson learned is that that's true that democracies cannot be imposed by guns, and states can collapse very easily if the foundation of the state is not strong enough.
I think you said an interesting point there, which is that democracies and states cannot be upheld by a gun, but they can be dismantled by a gun. And we've talked a lot over the last 2 years. You and I have talked about this, everyone on this panel. I think I've had individual conversations with you all about what the Afghan government did wrong. I think there's been 100 panels about what the Afghan government did wrong. But Trip, you've been following the Taliban for at least a decade. What did the Taliban do right? Not from a moral perspective, of course, but from a strategic and operational and tactical perspective from, let's say, 2013 onward, that put them in the position where they're ruling the country today?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that question was for Trip, but you know what, Shkula,
Oh.
I'll give you the first word.
Well, I'll answer this question very briefly. I think the main reason the Taliban won was the public support for them in rural areas, and the invasion of Afghanistan by the NATO troops and American troops. It automatically created anti-NATO and anti-West sentiments in Afghanistan between people. So Taliban used this opportunity, used this anti-West sentiments in their favor. That's why they won.
Shkula, a follow up on that. So you're saying that the support for the Taliban was less because of who the Taliban were and more because of what the Afghan government wasn't.
Exactly, what the Afghan government wasn't and who were supporters of Afghan government West.
Trip?
Yeah, Adam, I actually don't necessarily disagree with that. But as you said, there have been a ton of postmortems written about the fall of the Republic, most of which sort of focus on what the coalition did wrong, what the Afghan government did wrong, how essentially we lost the war. But rather than rehash those points, I think it's useful to discuss what the Taliban did well. And so I want to rewind a decade and go back to 2013, where I think is sort of one of the more consequential periods of the war. We all know now that Mullah Omar, the Taliban's first emir, died in April of 2013. And after his death, Akhtar Mohammad Mansour, the second emir, took sort of shadow control of the movement. It was unannounced at the time, and really initiated a series of reforms that centralized and professionalized the Taliban in a way I don't think that we really seen before, making them an organization that could withstand coalition military campaign to the extent it was then after the withdrawal in 2014 and 2015, and competing, to Shakula's point, competing with the Islamic Republic as a governing alternative. Mansour had really three major policy focuses. One was first to sort of diplomatically diversify away from Pakistan, and he maneuvered the TPC to effectively build relationships and contacts really throughout the international community, but really most importantly, to deeply improve the relationship with the Iranians, again, receiving sort of critical material support, to a lesser extent, improve the relationships with the Russians and the Chinese. Secondly, he improved the effectiveness of the Taliban military campaign by adding layers of bureaucracy, centralizing command and control, and reducing reliance on sort of local commanders and individuals. This allowed the Taliban to use resources more efficiently, to move fighters throughout the country in a way that we hadn't seen before, so more easily, pressure key strategic positions. And really the direct consequence of this was the Taliban targeting, and in some cases, taking control of provincial capitals from 2015 onward. And then finally, I just mentioned about the governance piece. He really renewed Taliban commitment to establish competent governance in an attempt to be this viable alternative to the Islamic Republic, particularly in rural areas, in areas that sort of were generally more favorable toward the Taliban. Mansour expanded the Taliban's civil service commission system, and the system sort of broadly mirrored the Islamic Republic's ministries, and installed competent bureaucrats. Later on, I think actually we saw this help with a smoother transition to governing after the takeover than we may have otherwise witnessed. And even today, I think we sort of underestimate the Taliban's ability to govern well in the face of pretty severe resource constraints. So these reforms, again, along with our reduction in forces, I think set the fundamentals for the rest of the war from 2013, 2014 onward, where the Taliban gained control and influence over territory, every year, and it allowed them to more easily take advantage of all the things mentioned in the postmortems, endemic corruption, war weariness, problems plaguing the Afghan security forces. When the Taliban eventually changed their policy preference from pursuing a political resolution and decided to take the country through a series of local negotiated settlements and military force. And I think it's instructive not only to understand the context of the fall of the republic, but also to understand the evolution of the Taliban to today, to understand them as an organization, to help us devise a strategy that increases the odds of achieving U.S. interests and objectives.
So I'm going to ask you a provocative question, and feel free to disregard it if you want to. But my impression, is that Mansour was a bit more sophisticated and perhaps worldly of a leader than the current emir, and that the current emir is more a part of the clerical elite, perhaps, in comparison. And I wonder, is there any, if we could go back and do things again, was it a mistake to kill Mansour?
I do think it was a mistake to kill Mansour. I mean, the counterfactual is hard. You never know. I don't necessarily know. Mansour is sort of a political animal, and I think by all assessments, sort of more pragmatic. I don't know if that means that he necessarily would sort of give in or capitulate on Taliban core interests. I don't know how different negotiations would look. Sort of the framework of the negotiations. But as you think about, whether or not you engage with one interlocutor or another, I think you don't think about, you think about increasing the chances of a better outcome, right? And I think engaging with Mansour, and at the time Mansour, the TPC chief was Tayyip Agha, who was also sort of more of a pragmatist and moderate. I think engaging with that crew increases the chances of a better outcome in Afghanistan. Increases the chances of real political resolution than the sort of crew we negotiated with.
Hey, Adam, I would just chime in real quick on that and say, to Tripp's point, I don't know, the counterfactual is, you can argue it one way or the other, certainly depending on which direction you want to take it. I will say, though, at the time that Mansour was killed, I asked, a bunch of people I knew in the US government at the time, whether they had thought through what the succession strategy might be, what the second and third order effects might be of that move. And the answer I basically got was not really. They had the shot and they took it, for what that's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, if you have, I don't disagree with that. I think if the president has that shot, it's hard to say no, for sure. Nonetheless,
in some sense, that's a metaphor for the entire war effort. But bottom line of what happened is that the Taliban were in an ascendant position, and then the Trump administration began to negotiate with the Taliban. Shkula, I wonder if you can put yourself back in the frame of mind you had maybe around that time between 2018 and 2020 when these negotiations are happening. What did you feel as a young Afghan at the time when the US was beginning to negotiate with the Taliban and try to come up, hopefully, or at least they wanted a settlement to the conflict? I think you're on mute.
So between those years, obviously, I was very young, but the very prominent and crucial year for me was that 2020, because negotiations were at its peak, and I was the Afghan youth representative to the United Nations. My main responsibility was to advocate for meaningful peace and for inclusion of women and youth in those negotiations. And in short, I was advocating for positive peace, and we were afraid of whatever that is happening today. And I was amplifying Afghans' voices and their concerns and demands regarding the peace negotiations. We were hopeful that the negotiations would include Afghan government and Afghans and our demands and our concerns. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. Everything happened behind closed doors. And well, there were multiple internal factors that contributed to weakening of the regime, mainly corruption and political turbulence. But I firmly believe that Doha Peace Agreement was the main driver of the collapse of the Republic and the collapse of Afghanistan and all the achievements that we have made through all those decades. And it was supposed to protect the Republic. And protecting the Republic would mean protecting women's rights and all the achievements. But it didn't happen. All the US cared about was, well, we couldn't realize this back then. For at least I personally, I was very optimistic, but now I realize that all the US really cared about was a safe exit and then a convenient deal for them. The Afghan government was excluded from the negotiations, and the concerns and demands of Afghans were overlooked. And finally, it happened. And as I mentioned, honestly, we were not expecting this to happen because 2 decades is a very long time, and trillions of dollars were invested in Afghanistan. Lives were the war costed millions of lives, and but unfortunately, it was a very reckless and a very, I would say, selfish move from US. We were hopeful, but we were shocked when the actual deal came out.
So the views you express, Shkula, I've heard from many Afghans, and a recap of the agreement. It did get exactly what you said, which was that it got the U.S. in some sense a safe exit, leaving aside the ISKP attack that took 13 U.S. service members and 180 something Afghans. Mm-hmm. But the U.S. troops weren't targeted. I guess my first question is for you, Shkula, and then I have a follow-up for Trip. Do you think that the United States was honest about all of the rhetoric it had over the years that it told Afghans about, that this support was about democracy building and we were going to stick with you, or do you think it was political opportunism, or do you think it was a bit of both?
And it was political. Like they were trying to show that they are supporting us. They're and they're doing whatever that that should be in favor of us. But I think after a while, it got due to several reasons, mainly because of the lack of efficient diplomatic affairs between Afghan government and US government, it got failed. And I believe that as the deal was supposed to, I remember Khalilzad said that nothing will be agreed until everything is agreed. But eventually, nothing was agreed. The only thing that was agreed that the territory of Afghanistan should not be used against US national interests or its allies' national interests. So I think it was to some extent they were really trying to do, but they didn't know how to do it effectively. But after a point, I think they started dodging and they started just acting reckless.
Okay, thank you for that. And Trip, let's talk about the deal a little bit from a US perspective. In some sense, we got a lot for the deal. The Taliban were in an ascendant position militarily. They stopped targeting US troops. I think 2 US soldiers had been killed in insider attacks just before the Doha Agreement was signed, and then the attacks ceased, even though the US continued to enable the Afghan security forces, continued to conduct airstrikes, which of course were pretty deadly for the Taliban. But the Taliban were disciplined enough, at least so far as dealing with US troops, that they didn't target US troops. And the United States got its exit from Afghanistan. Of course, like most deals, designed to end a conflict, it was not a completely balanced deal. I think it could be objectively argued that the deal offered the Taliban a little bit more than it offered, certainly more than it offered the Afghan government, and in some ways it gave them a bit of an advantage. Is that the result of bad negotiating, or is that the result of the reality that the Taliban were in an ascendant position and this is the reality of the deal we could get?
Yeah, and going back to what I said about sort of the evolution of the Taliban over the sort of decade prior. Again, I really think that plus some policy decisions, including withdrawal, set the fundamentals for the war. When we started negotiating in 2018, we were in a sort of a tough position militarily. The Taliban had gained advantage throughout the countryside and pressured a bunch of provincial capitals throughout the country, including the north. They took over Kunduz a couple times throughout the war, so they were in a good negotiating position relative to when talks started. Right? I mean, it's not like this is the first time we started talking to the Taliban. We've been talking to the Taliban for the better part of a decade about a potential political solution. Coming pretty close in 2013, sort of the first Doha negotiations. We're in a much stronger position in terms of our leverage to negotiate a better deal. That said, the deal has a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of things we want, including a lot of very specific commitments on what the Taliban would do on counterterrorism to protect the United States, its allies, and the Taliban have expanded that commitment, basically to the entire world. And maybe most importantly, and something we were shooting for, and I think one of the reasons why we started to have this conversation about the international question of the Taliban first. Was because it was the way to get the Afghans in the same room together. It was a way to get the Islamic Republic and the Taliban to sit down to formal public talks sanctioned by their leadership for the first time ever. I mean, obviously there have been sort of secret talks and fits and starts about processes and back channeling about maybe a political resolution. But these two parties had never sat down in formal public talks before, and the Doha Agreement sort of paved the way for that. It gave the Afghans the opportunity to end the war through political resolution, end the war peacefully. It didn't turn out. Sometimes diplomacy doesn't work, but for the faults that are out there in the public about the Doha deal, it did give Afghans the opportunity to come to a political resolution.
Somebody said in the questions that the Afghan government, and it's an Afghan in the questions, said that the Afghan government didn't take this process seriously. Do you think that's, I'll also hear other Afghans say, look, they had their hands tied behind their back. They didn't have any leverage. As Shkula pointed out, a lot of these talks were happening without them. By the time they were included, the Taliban were completely intransigent. It took the Taliban and the Afghan government months to even agree to a set of rules for talking, let alone talking substantively. Did the Afghan government squander this opportunity, or was it an opportunity that just that wasn't there for the taking to begin with?
I don't see how they didn't see this coming, and that this was going to be sort of the policy push and policy outcome from the United States. 3 presidents had talked about withdrawing from Afghanistan, had talked about political resolution, had opened and continued talks with the Taliban. I understand that the Afghan government was not a signatory to Doha, but we were in constant communication with the Afghan government, with President Ghani and his team. Ambassador Khalilzad was in Doha. I mean, I don't want to misstate this or get this wrong, but almost every month in 2019, debriefing the Islamic Republic on what was going on in Doha, not only talking to Ghani and his team, but other leaders throughout the government, security leaders included. They were well briefed on what was happening throughout the process. So to the extent that they were unprepared, I don't see how that could be the case. I think that's sort of on them. They didn't see this coming. In terms of how the talks ended up, and they were kind of slow. I think there was some reason on both sides that they would want to slow that process. One, I think the Ghani administration saw a change in administration as a way to maybe pitch a different policy approach, and so they had some incentive to delay the talks. And the Taliban, again, going back to my previous comments, saw that they were year by year progressing on the battlefield. So they didn't necessarily have an incentive to quickly come to a conclusion either. That said, these processes, very often take years. So to think that we were going to get a solution, super quickly, I think was a bit misguided. Anyway, the timing worked out where the incentives were in place for both parties is where it slow rolled that a little bit.
So it got slow rolled. The U.S. withdrew. As the U.S. was withdrawing, the Taliban took over the country. The rest is history. Let's try to spend the last 25 minutes of this looking about what's happened since then and looking forward. John, you and I have both discussed the U.S. Taliban agreement ad nauseum. What's interesting to me is that the Taliban themselves in the statements they make still reference it. Now, you could make a case that they violated many aspects of it, and you could even make a case that at least in the run-up to the withdrawal, the U.S. violated some aspects of it as well. And of course, that's true for most agreements like this. But it seems to me that the Taliban still like to think that the Doha Agreement is in effect. Do you think, and by the way, Khalilzad is constantly talking about the Doha Agreement and seems to be attached to it and still sees it very much as a roadmap. Does the Doha Agreement still have value today?
I think, a short answer is yes, but a more nuanced answer is when you say, does it have value today, you're saying sort of like, does it have value for whom, right? I think when you look at the Taliban side, your comment was the Taliban say it still has value. I think there are certain parts of the Taliban, certain members of the Taliban who says it has value, right? The Taliban's spokesperson says it has value. The Taliban, diplomats, if you want to call them that, the folks that sort of came from the political, wing, the Doha office, et cetera, they're the ones who say that it has value. Has the supreme leader of the Taliban declared that the agreement with the U.S. has value? Not to my knowledge. So there are some elements of the Taliban that say it has value, and it looks to me like those are the elements of the Taliban who were sort of the part of the political wing, part of the Doha office, part of the ones who negotiated this agreement to begin with, right? And so it has value for them. I'm sure from strategic view, right? These are also the sort of members of the Taliban, if you will, who still believe that international recognition is important, that it would have value for the Taliban to be internationally recognized, that they could have a relationship with the US and the rest of the international community in a way that is akin to how other countries behave, right? And are recognized and interact. So there is that part of the Taliban that sees value in that type of political future for the country. And for them, the agreement has value. I'm less convinced that the more militant parts of the Taliban see it the same way, right? And similarly, on the U.S. side, for example, yes, the people who were involved in the negotiations of the agreement, most notably Khalilzad, say that the agreement still has value, that it still represents, a coming together of the two sides in a way that can be built upon going forward. But I don't hear that type of language coming out of the current administration. I don't hear Tom West. I don't hear, Secretary Blinken talking about the U.S. Taliban agreement as something that is foundational on which we can build our engagements with them going forward. So I wouldn't say it's devoid of value. I think there is still some value there, but I think the value depends greatly on, sort of which specific audience you're talking about.
Shkula, John mentioned something which I often hear in U.S. policy circles, which is a distinction between the more pragmatic Taliban, sometimes they're called the Doha Taliban, or the folks who are close to Mullah Baradar, and the less, even today people will say Sirajuddin Haqqani is pragmatic, which he wasn't viewed that way in the past necessarily. And then there's people like the Taliban that are close to the Emir, the Kandahari Taliban, the hardline Taliban, and we'll make this distinction. As an Afghan, do you see a distinction, or do you see the Taliban, in one way? And do you think there's some Taliban who can be worked with and other Taliban who are beyond the pale? How do you view it?
I personally believe there is no serious distinction between the Taliban. At the end of the day, they all believe they all have a set of common values, beliefs, and whatever they have fought for through all those 2 decades. But yeah, in terms of like some of the Taliban, they understand the value of interaction with international community and that they won't survive for too long if they do not get their recognition. In terms of interaction with international community, there are Taliban that are like different from the rest of them. But in terms of internal affairs, how to govern Afghanistan, how to lead Afghanistan in future, political inclusion, human rights, women's rights, I think all of them are conservative and all of them are very extremist. So I mean, if they are like distinctions, it would be just like in terms of interacting with international community to some extent, just to get what they want to have. But otherwise, I personally believe that all of them are the same.
Trip, you are part of that international community that has negotiated with the Taliban. One, maybe you could just tell us, what is it like to negotiate with the Taliban? And two, do you think there's ways outside leverage that the world has with the Taliban? Do outside actors have the ability to shape the Taliban movement in any way?
Two great questions, and maybe longest answers. I'll take the first one about what it's like to negotiate with the Taliban, and that might inform a little bit of the second answer. But sort of in a word, it's frustrating, right? But I think you sort of knew that going into negotiations, that like striking this deal that considered interests and objectives of both sides would be really challenging and frustrating. Like I said before, the United States had talked to the Taliban for the better part of a decade going forward with like little progress on political resolution. And as many of the viewers may know, the Taliban had this really slow and consultative decision-making process. It doesn't really adhere to counterparts' timelines, and so negotiations were pretty long and grueling. But by the end of the process, we were negotiating like on a daily basis, beyond midnight, making for really tiresome days. But those policy debates and observing that diplomatic dance and struggle to advance our interests in negotiations isn't really what I'll take away from being a part of that team and observing that. What I learned and grew to deeply appreciate is the importance of sort of understanding your counterpart on a more human level, particularly one that your country had been at war with for decades, rather than understanding them through this sort of narrative produced by decades of war and misunderstandings. More practically, that talking to them and trying to understand them at that level is really the only way to build good strategies and policies that have a chance to advance those interests that we're talking about. And so it's those sort of more human interactions that I remember, despite our different worldviews and interests and objectives, that we have this shared humanity, that despite regrettable action on both sides, that the people in that room, the leaders who had sanctioned the talks, were trying to chart a better way forward toward a political resolution. So it's the shared meals and the shared stories about families and them conveying that they want peace and want to return to their homeland, and even sort of the quiet conversations on the sidelines about different policies and sort of understanding and then demonstrating that there's a wide range of viewpoints within the Taliban. Like they may put on a pretty cohesive face, and the stated Taliban priority is pretty consistent over time, but there is a lot of room for policy flexibility within the Taliban. And so I know that sounds sort of like fairly basic diplomacy 101, but I think we lack that sort of understanding of the Taliban, only having occasionally interactions with them over the years. And those occasional interactions were pretty narrowly scoped to a group of US interlocutors that really helped lead to poor policy decisions over the course of the war. So I think I'll leave it at that unless you have any follow-ups on that particular answer. But there are some lessons learned out of that. So that's sort of like what it is to negotiate with Taliban from my perspective. But there's some lessons that I learned from observing negotiations. And so the first lesson is, and this is sort of a broader lesson of our engagement with them during the war, is they're really willing to absorb high costs and movement to achieve their goals. And so as a result, and Adam, I know you've written about this, punitive actions and threats should be weighed less as a viable option in determining sort of engagement strategies. Like, I understand the need for a multifaceted diplomatic formula that includes both carrots and sticks, but we really, I think, should prioritize carrots right now in the near term, developing a recipe that builds constructive and cooperative relationships. The more the world pressures the Taliban, the more likely their position will entrench. I think that's sort of a lesson well learned over the last 20 years, right? Second lesson is the Taliban need a little bit more international exposure. This is not to say they have bad diplomats, they don't, but they're not as familiar with the sort of processes and constraints of the international system and sort of international organizations. They lack that institutional understanding of international organizations. And so the international community needs to do a really good job of educating them on how difficult it is to do some of the things they want, right? I mean, this is particularly important in the sanctions relief or sanctions conversation. So some education needs to happen from the international community to the Taliban about how that works and what the constraints are there and how hard multilateral engagements on these issues are. And lastly, and I mentioned this earlier, the Taliban doesn't rush timelines for deliverables and actions. Their timelines are always far slower than their counterparts. So we just have to maintain patience as the Taliban works through difficult policy processes, right? Just because they're not making a decision on our timeline doesn't mean there's necessarily a lack of policy space. It may mean that, but the timeline doesn't necessarily tell us that, right? And sort of at the same time, you should remember, and this goes back to sort of your previous question to Jonathan and Shakula, the Taliban, it's not a monolith. There is a lot of policy space among different Taliban on any set of issues, including women and girls. But there are real limits on their policy flexibility as they balance engagement with the world in different domestic local constituencies. And right now, that balance is tilted well in favor of sort of the former fighter constituency, right? And so that's why you're seeing less political or policy flexibility. That doesn't mean there won't be policy flexibility in the longer term.
Yeah, as an example of that, it seems like Mullah Baradar is reduced to cutting ribbon ceremonies for new roads and things like that, even though you could make the case that he was one of the Taliban most responsible for their victory in some sense. And he was also there from the beginning. I guess a question I have for you, a quick follow-up, Trip, is that people have criticized the U.S. war in Afghanistan by saying the U.S. fought 21-year wars and never thought about the big picture. Are we doing the same thing diplomatically now, thinking about things year by year when perhaps this is a generational struggle in a sense?
I don't think so. I think we have a little bit better perspective now, and my sense is that the folks who are engaging in Taliban understand it's a longer term struggle. I'm encouraged by recent meetings to the extent we know what happened in sort of the public, the public messaging on this, that folks are focusing on ways to build confidence and trust with the Taliban, rather than trying to sort of achieve these like really achieve our stated objectives, which are really difficult to do with the Taliban in the short run. They're really politically sensitive within the organization. They're politically sensitive in both systems. And so this move to, as we saw in Tom West's public messaging, this move to, talk about CBMs seems like maybe a move to build trust and have conversations where you could build a better relationship with Taliban and better achieve those longer term objectives later on. And so it seems to me like there is a better perspective about taking the long view on this and not trying to just achieve what's very difficult in the short term.
Thanks for that. I'm going to switch gears for a moment. It might be a little bit abrupt, but as usual, this hour is flying by. John, I don't think we can finish this panel without talking a little bit about CT. We've talked about what diplomacy is like with the Taliban. We've talked about the Taliban themselves. But what about CT? I mean, this is what the Bush administration, Bush administration's invasion of Afghanistan was all about. People forget this, but the Bush administration did give Mullah Omar several warnings. The ISI chief at the time, back in 2001, gave Mullah Omar several warnings. Whether we want to accept this or not, the reality is that the United States at that time, at least for a couple of weeks, was willing to live with the Taliban so long as they delivered al-Qaeda. Of course, Mullah Omar, thinking he had all the time in the world, as Trip has said about the Taliban and their sense of time, just remarked to the ISI chief that he would think about it, and the rest is history. But is the Doha Agreement living up to expectations so far as CT? Do you think the Taliban have been a reliable CT partner? They seem to have fallen short on most other accounts, at least so far as human rights and women's rights and inclusivity and things like that. How are they doing on CT, and how can the U.S. protect its interests?
Sure. So there were a lot of statements with question marks there. So let me back up.
I'm looking at the clock and I'm panicking.
Yeah, no, I understand. Let me unpack that as quickly as I can. First, let me say the Taliban are not a counterterrorism partner of the United States. And that word gets thrown around, I think, a lot of times pejoratively, especially by people who are anti-engagement with the Taliban, right? They call it, you sort of hear that term used pejoratively by two camps. One is the anti-engagement crowd, and the other is the Taliban are terrorists themselves crowd, right? And they'll criticize this idea of relying on the Taliban as a counterterrorism partner. The U.S. is not doing that. Let's be clear, right? The U.S. has its own over-the-horizon counterterrorism platform that it is using to monitor developments inside Afghanistan as best it can. It was that capability that struck Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul and killed him, right, a year or so ago. So the U.S. is not relying on the Taliban as a partner for counterterrorism. Now, there's a lot of rumors circulating that, perhaps the U.S. is occasionally giving the Taliban intelligence, right? There have been various meetings between CIA officials and senior Taliban officials that are publicly known. Whether that's happening or not, I can't say, right? I honestly don't know. But there are those rumors, right? And it wouldn't surprise me if there is some amount of, hey, we're seeing this, could you do something about that? But that type of, tit for tat or limited intelligence exchange, if it's occurring, is still a pretty far cry from someone being a partner of yours in counterterrorism, right? So I would start there. That said, the Taliban themselves have interestingly evolved over the last 2 years to become a much more effective counterterrorism force, if you will, than they were in August of 2021, right? I mean, the immediate aftermath of their takeover, they went after the Islamic State in Afghanistan, and they did so in very heavy-handed, sort of brutally suppressive, large area sweeps, type operations. That really angered a lot of the people in the areas that they went into, and they weren't particularly effective. In fact, I wrote an article, a year or so ago with Colin Clark in which we called them brutally ineffective. Interestingly, though, over the course of 2023, what we've seen is the Taliban have moved away from these heavy-handed large area sweeps, and they have moved to what looked like, again, from the outside, I haven't obviously been in Afghanistan to observe these operations closely, but as best I can tell, what they're engaging in now are intel-driven raids against specific targets that they've identified as, housing, being a safe house for some number of Islamic State terrorists. And they appear to be pretty effective in conducting those raids. We saw earlier this year the amount of media output that the Islamic State was putting out, for example, took a huge nosedive. The number of attacks that, total numbers of attacks that the Islamic State has conducted in Afghanistan have gone way down this year. So by the various metrics that one might look at, the Islamic State appears to have been significantly degraded over the course of this year by the Taliban. So again, the extent to which the U.S. is helping them in that regard is publicly unknown, and anything you read about that is pure speculation. But the fact remains, the Islamic State is under a fair amount of pressure from the Taliban right now, and Al-Qaeda, contrary to a lot of what sort of alarmist predictions, has not reconstituted. itself in Afghanistan. I mean, it still has not announced who the successor to Zawahiri is as the leader of al-Qaeda. Most people assume, most analysts that I know assume that Saif al-Adil has taken over de facto leadership of the organization. But those same analysts primarily assume that he's still located in Iran under some form of house arrest. So al-Qaeda as an organization, al-Qaeda Central, if you will, is largely defunct at this point in time.
Okay, thanks for that. You gave a really great summary, which makes up for the fact that we don't have too much time for follow-ups. Shkula, I'm going to ask you a question. If you can keep it to a couple minutes, that would be great. And then we might go 1 or 2 minutes over, and we'll do a quick lightning round for final thoughts. Shkula, you lived in Afghanistan until August 2021. During those years leading up to the collapse, sometimes I'd hear different things from Afghans inside Afghanistan and Afghans outside of Afghanistan. And now you're part of the diaspora, and there's divisions within the diaspora to the point where I have to applaud you for agreeing to come on this panel, because it can be a brave thing to do. How should U.S. diplomats and U.S. policymakers balance the views of the diaspora that you're now part of? I know not by choice, and those Afghans who are effectively voiceless who remain inside Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. The diaspora, Afghan diaspora, is divided into 2 parts. First, the recent immigrants to West or US, and the second is like those who left Afghanistan earlier. Both of them are to some extent unfamiliar or disconnected from the ground realities of Afghanistan. But one thing is common between them. All Afghans in diaspora and also within Afghanistan, they want election. They want a democratic regime. They want political inclusivity. They want every ethnic group to be part of the government, and they want women to be part of the government. So for US government and for US diplomats or for the foreign policy makers, I think it's good to stay connected with Afghans within Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, considering the common points or the common ground that they both have. Unfortunately, US diplomats are not effectively engaging with Afghan diaspora and Afghans within the country, whatever they are doing. For example, Rina Amiri or Tom West, those people, I think they are not doing sufficient job. They are just showing off that as if they are engaging with diaspora and West and Afghans within the country. But if they really want to carry on their job effectively, I think there are some common things between both Afghans that they can work for. For example, they can start engagements with the Taliban and finally persuade them to go towards elections, because the election is the only way to get to a legitimate and inclusive and democratic government. Otherwise, I think this situation will continue, and we will not see any positive changes.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We're going to do a quick lightning round. We might go 1 minute or 2 minutes over. So try to keep it to 30 seconds if you can. Imagine you're in a room with Tom West or Rina Amiri or somebody who's handling the Afghanistan portfolio. I know for some of you that's not even something you have to imagine. It might actually happen. But if you had 30 seconds to give them advice about what to do next, I'm going to do something that we don't like to do in Washington, which is to give a policy prescription that is on the record. You have 30 seconds with them. What would you say? How about we start with you, Trip?
To the extent possible, quiet your public messaging, particularly on women and girls. Amplify public messaging only raises stakes and restricts policy options on the Taliban side. 2, meet more often with Taliban senior officials. To the extent possible, try to press to renew the travel waivers so the Taliban senior officials can travel more easily. 3, use engagement to cooperate on less politically sensitive issues. I think we may be seeing the starts of that, including counter-narcotics, disability programming, disaster relief, trafficking persons, a bunch of things that are of mutual interest to show that to the Taliban, demonstrated to the Taliban that we're willing to cooperate with the group and that sincere cooperation is in their interest. I think this will help achieve those sort of longer term, policy objectives. And fourth, use that engagement to expand your reach into the Taliban, building associations with the group's sort of mid-level bureaucracy, setting up a productive and working relationship with sort of the next generation of Taliban leaders.
John?
Yeah, that was a great answer, Trip. On top of that, I guess I would start by saying, set your successor up for success. Recognize there are, contrary to what you will hear the debate around DC, there are no quick fixes to the problems that exist in Afghanistan. There are no policy prescriptions that we could put in place that will magically make things the way we want them to be in a year or 2 years from now, right? At best, we could hope for evolutionary changes in the Taliban's policies over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's a really hard thing to say to people in DC, because that's not the way they like to think. But that is the nature of this situation. So the best thing that Tom West or Rina can do is to stop, not think about what it is that they can accomplish during their time, but how can they move the ball down the field and set whoever comes up after them to continue to do that. And the person after that as well, right? What can you do to set up your successor for success? That's the mindset they need to have.
Shula, why don't you close it out for us?
Well, first of all, the priority should be Afghan women. They should work with the Taliban, negotiate, engage with the Taliban, and persuade them to remove the bans and restrictions on girls' education and women's work and women's political and social participation. Second, I strongly believe that the United States and their allies should not engage with the notorious corrupt Afghan government authorities. And also the third point would be that while they are engaging with the Taliban or having negotiations with the Taliban, there's a very thin line between negotiating and between giving someone leverage or momentum. So that should be like they should not make Taliban feel that powerful that they will start making demands, because the Taliban are not in a situation. They also need international recognition and the support of the United States. So that should be maintained, and engagement should be done in a way that, again, the demands and concerns and needs of Afghans should be met. Otherwise, I think it will be another mistake and waste of time.
That's a good point, especially that the Taliban still needs US aid and things like that. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining. I've learned a lot from you all. I think we could go on another 2 hours, but we'll have to save it for another panel. Thanks to the guests who stayed on a few minutes over as well. We tried to get to some of the Q&A questions, but we didn't get to all of them. We have other panels coming up, so just go to the Quincy Institute website, quincyinst.org. or just search Quincy Institute and go to the events page, and you can register for them. Well, anyway, thanks for joining, and I hope you all join again.